What is about to be revealed represents the most dangerous pattern in modern history, and every major power center on Earth is watching America repeat it in real time. In the span of just 18 months, the United States has crossed every single threshold that preceded the Soviet collapse, and the parallels are not metaphorical. They are structural, they are measurable, and they are accelerating. Tonight, you are going to see something that mainstream analysis refuses to acknowledge because the implications are too disturbing for establishment commentators to process. The Soviet Union received 5 distinct warnings between 1979 and 1985 that its imperial model was entering terminal decline. Soviet leadership ignored every single one. America has now received those exact same 5 warnings between 2022 and 2024. American leadership is ignoring every single one. This is not prophecy. This is pattern recognition using the same structural analysis that predicted the 2008 financial crisis, the Arab Spring, and the failure of maximum pressure campaigns against Iran and North Korea. 5 questions will drive everything that follows. What were the 5 warnings the Soviets received? Why did ignoring them guarantee collapse? How is America repeating each pattern with eerie precision? What does game theory tell us happens next? And most critically, what does a world look like after American imperial collapse? There are no comfortable answers tonight, but the truth, however brutal, is the only thing worth saying. By the end of this analysis, you will understand why the next 5 to 10 years will determine whether America follows the Soviet trajectory or finds some exit that no previous empire in this situation has ever discovered. Let me be clear from the beginning, I am not rooting for American failure. I am analyzing the structural forces that make it increasingly probable, regardless of what any of us want. Warning 1, military overextension in unwinnable geography. The first warning the Soviet Union received was Afghanistan. In December 1979, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan, expecting a quick stabilization operation that would secure their southern flank and demonstrate continued imperial reach. What they got instead was a 10-year bleeding ulcer that drained Soviet resources, destroyed military morale, and demonstrated to the entire world that Soviet conventional superiority meant nothing against determined asymmetric resistance. Here is what the numbers actually showed. The Soviets deployed 115,000 troops at peak. They spent approximately $20 billion over 10 years, which represented between 2 to 3% of Soviet GDP annually. They suffered 15,000 dead, 35,000 wounded, and ultimately withdrew in complete defeat, having accomplished precisely 0 strategic objectives. The Mujahideen, armed with weapons costing a fraction of Soviet equipment, created a cost-exchange ratio that made the war economically unsustainable. But the real damage was not the direct costs. The real damage was what Afghanistan revealed about Soviet military capability. The Red Army that had terrified NATO for 40 years could not defeat farmers with rifles in mountain terrain. That revelation changed every calculation about Soviet power. If the Soviets could not win in Afghanistan, what else were they unable to do? The mystique of Soviet invincibility shattered, and with it went the psychological foundation of deterrence that held the empire together. Now look at America's pattern. The United States has been in Afghanistan for 20 years, far longer than the Soviets. America deployed 100,000 troops at peak, spent over $2 trillion, and withdrew in August 2021 in arguably more humiliating circumstances than the Soviet withdrawal in 1989. The Taliban controls more territory today than they did in 2001. Every single strategic objective failed. But America did not learn from Afghanistan. Instead, America has now committed to indefinite military presence in Syria, Iraq, continued operations in Somalia, Yemen, and across the Sahel, while simultaneously preparing for potential major war with China over Taiwan and continuing to supply unlimited weapons to Ukraine. The overextension is not accidental. It is structural. The American military-industrial complex requires constant conflict to justify its $877 billion annual budget. That budget represents more than the next 10 countries combined. Yet America has not won a major war since 1945 if you exclude the Gulf War turkey shoot against an already decimated Iraqi military. The parallel to late Soviet military overextension is exact. Massive spending, global deployment, technological superiority, and consistent failure to achieve strategic objectives against determined resistance. Here is the game theory reality that both empires refuse to face. Asymmetric warfare creates unsustainable cost ratios. A Houthi drone costs $20,000. An American interceptor missile costs $1 million. That is a 105-to-1 cost exchange ratio. A Taliban IED costs $30 to make. An American MRAP vehicle costs $500,000. Even if America wins every tactical engagement, which it does not, the economic math makes extended conflict unwinnable. The Soviets ignored this math. They believed that superior technology and unlimited willingness to use force would eventually break resistance. They were wrong. America is ignoring the exact same math, believing that precision weapons and technological dominance will compensate for strategic incoherence and cost disadvantage. The outcome will be identical. Warning, 2, economic stagnation masked by resource extraction. The second warning the Soviet Union received was the oil price collapse of 1985-1986. Soviet GDP growth had been declining since the mid-1970s, masked by high oil prices that generated hard currency through energy exports. When oil prices crashed from $30 per barrel to below $10 in 18 months, the Soviet economy lost its cushion. The underlying stagnation became impossible to hide. The Soviet economy had stopped generating productivity growth by the late 1970s. Central planning could not adapt to technological change. Innovation was strangled by bureaucracy. The military consumed 15 to 17% of GDP, starving civilian sectors of investment. The only thing keeping the system afloat was resource extraction, primarily oil and gas exports to Western Europe. When that revenue collapsed, the entire house of cards began falling. Now examine America's economic pattern. American GDP growth has been declining steadily since the 1960s. Average annual growth was 4% in the 1960s, 2% in the 1970s, 2% in the 1980s, 1% in the 1990s, 9% in the 2000s, 6% in the 2010s, and is currently projected at 8% for the 2020s, despite massive stimulus spending. But the real parallel is more specific than overall growth decline. America, like late-period Soviet Union, has increasingly relied on resource extraction rather than productivity growth. The shale oil boom of 2010 to 2020 temporarily masked underlying economic weakness, exactly as Soviet oil did in the 1970s. American total petroleum production increased from 5 million barrels per day in 2008 to 13 million barrels per day by 2019, creating the illusion of economic vitality. The problem is that shale oil is extraordinarily expensive to extract, requires constant drilling to maintain production, and only becomes profitable above $50 per barrel. The moment oil prices decline substantially or global demand shifts due to recession or alternative energy transition, American shale becomes economically unviable. The Saudis understand this perfectly, which is why they have repeatedly flooded markets to damage American shale producers. More importantly, the resource extraction model reveals the absence of genuine productivity growth. American median wages adjusted for inflation have been stagnant since 1973. American life expectancy is declining, the first major developed economy to experience sustained decline outside of wartime. American infrastructure receives a D+ grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers. These are symptoms of economic stagnation, not vitality. The manufacturing base that created genuine wealth has been systematically dismantled. America now imports $650 billion more in goods than it exports annually. The trade deficit is financed through dollar dominance, but that dominance rests on global willingness to hold dollar reserves. The moment that willingness erodes, the entire model collapses exactly as Soviet resource dependence collapsed when oil prices fell. The Soviets told themselves that temporary resource revenue difficulties would pass, and underlying economic strength would reassert itself. There was no underlying strength. America tells itself the same story. The shale boom will continue, dollar dominance is permanent, and productivity growth will magically return. The structural reality suggests otherwise. Shark, the warning. 3. Loss of ideological credibility among allies. The third warning the Soviet Union received was the Polish Solidarity movement beginning in 1980. For the first time, workers in a socialist state explicitly rejected socialist ideology and demanded Western-style reforms. The ideological model that supposedly delivered worker liberation was being rejected by actual workers. Soviet leadership faced a critical choice. They could allow Poland to pursue independent reforms, which would demonstrate that the Soviet model was not universal or inevitable. Or they could crush the movement, which would demonstrate that Soviet ideology required military force rather than genuine popular support. They chose military pressure, forcing Polish authorities to declare martial law in 1981. The decision preserved Soviet control temporarily, but destroyed Soviet ideological credibility permanently. Every Eastern European country now understood that Soviet socialism was maintained through coercion rather than conviction. The ideological foundation of the empire had fractured. When Gorbachev later signaled that military intervention would no longer enforce compliance, the entire bloc collapsed within months. Now look at America's ideological trajectory. American global influence has historically rested on ideological appeal. Democracy, human rights, rule of law, free markets, individual liberty. The American model was supposed to deliver prosperity, freedom, and justice. Countries aligned with America not just for security guarantees, but because the American system seemed to work better than alternatives. That ideological credibility is collapsing at accelerating speed. America's closest European allies openly criticize American democratic dysfunction, gun violence, healthcare failures, and inequality. Germany and France actively pursue strategic autonomy from American security dependence. Saudi Arabia, a 75-year American ally, now coordinates energy policy with Russia and conducts military exercises with China. The most devastating ideological blow is Palestine. America claims to support human rights and international law while providing unlimited military support for actions that the International Court of Justice, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the UN Special Rapporteur have characterized as violations of international humanitarian law. The gap between stated values and actual policy destroys credibility. Global polling shows this clearly. According to Pew Research, favorable views of America have declined in nearly every country surveyed since 2002. In 2000, 83% of Germans had favorable views of the United States. By 2023, that number was 54%. In France, the decline went from 62% to 46%. In Mexico, America's neighbor and NAFTA partner, favorable views dropped from 68% to 42%. More importantly, among young people globally, American ideological appeal has collapsed. The generation that will shape the next 30 years does not view American democracy as a model to emulate. They view it as a cautionary tale of institutional decay, corporate capture, and democratic erosion. The Soviets lost ideological credibility when their own satellite populations rejected the model. America is losing ideological credibility as global populations, including allied populations, increasingly reject American leadership. The parallel is structural. When an empire's ideological foundation erodes, military and economic coercion alone cannot maintain the system indefinitely. Bureaucratic warning 4, unsustainable debt accumulation and fiscal crisis. The fourth warning the Soviet Union received was the escalating cost of maintaining empire relative to declining economic capacity. By the mid-1980s, Soviet military spending consumed between 15 to 17% of GDP, while social services deteriorated and consumer goods remained scarce. The fiscal equation had become unsustainable. Soviet planners faced impossible choices. They could reduce military spending, which would signal weakness and invite challenges from NATO and China. They could reduce social spending, which would trigger domestic unrest. Or they could continue unsustainable deficits financed through monetary expansion, which would generate inflation and currency crisis. They chose temporary deficit financing, believing that economic conditions would improve. They did not improve. The fiscal crisis manifested in currency collapse. The ruble's black market value diverged increasingly from official rates. By 1991, the official rate was 7 rubles per dollar, while the black market rate exceeded 100 rubles per dollar. The currency had lost all credibility, reflecting the underlying economic collapse. Now examine America's fiscal trajectory. The United States national debt currently stands at $34.8 trillion, representing 124% of GDP. For reference, debt was 35% of GDP in 1980, 55% in 2000, 82% in 2010, and has accelerated dramatically since. The trajectory is exponential, not linear. Annual deficits are now structural, not cyclical. America ran a $7 trillion deficit in fiscal year 2023 despite relatively strong economic growth. The deficit was not emergency pandemic spending or recession response. It was normal operations. The federal government spent $1 trillion while collecting $4 trillion in revenue. Here is where the math becomes unsustainable. Net interest payments on the national debt reached $659 billion in fiscal year 2023, representing 8% of all federal spending. That is more than America spends on veterans benefits, education, and agriculture combined. And that is at relatively low historical interest rates. If interest rates rise to historical averages, which the Federal Reserve has indicated will be necessary to control inflation, interest payments will exceed $1 trillion annually within 3 years. That would represent the second largest category of federal spending after Social Security, larger than defense, larger than Medicare. The fiscal trap is identical to what the Soviets faced. America cannot reduce military spending without signaling retreat from global commitments, which would accelerate the loss of hegemonic position. America cannot reduce social spending without triggering domestic political crisis in a country where 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So America continues deficit financing, believing that dollar dominance allows unlimited borrowing. The Soviets believed ruble dominance within their bloc allowed unlimited monetary expansion until suddenly it did not. America believes dollar dominance globally allows unlimited debt accumulation. The structural parallel is exact. The moment global actors lose confidence in the currency, the entire model implodes. China, Russia, Brazil, India, and Saudi Arabia are systematically reducing dollar reserves and increasing gold holdings, bilateral currency arrangements, and alternative payment systems. The process is gradual but accelerating. Global dollar reserves have declined from 73% in 2001 to 58% in 2023. That is a massive shift occurring largely outside American awareness. Barsher and Warning 5, catastrophic strategic defeat by proxy. The fifth and final warning the Soviet Union received was the Mujahideen victory in Afghanistan, combined with the Chernobyl disaster in 1986. These two events, occurring within months of each other, demonstrated that Soviet technological superiority was a myth and Soviet military power could be defeated by determined resistance. Chernobyl revealed that Soviet nuclear technology, supposedly the pride of Soviet science, was dangerously inferior. The disaster killed thousands, contaminated vast territories, and cost an estimated $18 billion, representing 2% of Soviet GDP for a single accident. More importantly, it destroyed domestic confidence that the Soviet system delivered superior results. Afghanistan revealed that Soviet military doctrine, designed to defeat NATO in Central Europe, was useless against asymmetric warfare. Your anti-year The Red Army withdrew in defeat, having accomplished nothing despite 10 years of effort and massive expenditure. The psychological impact on Soviet military morale and global perception of Soviet power was catastrophic. Now look at America's current trajectory. The Ukrainian proxy war represents America's Afghanistan moment occurring in real time. America has provided over $113 billion in military, economic, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine since February 2022. That represents approximately 0.4% of American GDP annually, a lower percentage than Soviet Afghanistan spending, but still substantial. The strategic objective was to weaken Russia through Ukrainian resistance, depleting Russian military capacity, and demonstrating Western technological and systemic superiority. The outcome is nearly the opposite. Russia's economy has proven more resilient than expected, growing 6% in 2023 despite unprecedented sanctions. Russian military production has ramped to levels exceeding current Western capacity. Russia is producing 250,000 artillery shells monthly, while all of Europe combined produces approximately 30,000. More critically, the war has accelerated the formation of an anti-Western bloc, including Russia, China, Iran, and increasingly the global South. The BRICS expansion in 2023 added Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran, representing 45% of global population and 35% of global GDP at purchasing power parity. This bloc is explicitly organizing alternative economic and security structures to reduce Western dominance. The Ukrainian war was supposed to isolate Russia. Instead, it has isolated the West. The United Nations vote condemning the Russian invasion received support from countries representing only 41% of global population. The majority of humanity, including India, China, most of Africa, most of Latin America, and increasingly the Middle East, has refused to support Western sanctions or isolation efforts. This represents catastrophic strategic failure comparable to Soviet Afghanistan. America bet that proxy war would break Russia and reinforce Western dominance. The outcome is strengthening multipolarity and accelerating de-dollarization. Every metric suggests the strategy has backfired. The parallel extends further. Just as Chernobyl revealed Soviet technological inferiority, American weapon systems in Ukraine have revealed significant vulnerabilities. The Patriot missile system, long marketed as invincible air defense, has been repeatedly defeated by Russian hypersonic missiles. Abrams tanks have proven vulnerable to Russian anti-tank weapons. Western ammunition stocks have been depleted at rates that cannot be sustained, revealing that American industrial capacity cannot support high-intensity conventional war. What happens next? The game theory of imperial collapse. Now that we understand the 5 warnings and how America is repeating each one, we need to examine what game theory and structural analysis predict happens next. The Soviet collapse offers a template, but there are critical differences that make American collapse potentially more destabilizing. The Soviet Union collapsed relatively peacefully because it was a land empire where subject populations could simply declare independence. The Russian Federation could retreat to ethnic Russian core territories. The transition was economically catastrophic, but avoided major interstate war. America is a different structure. American power rests on global dollar dominance, military presence in over 750 foreign bases, and alliance systems spanning NATO, ANZUS, and bilateral agreements across Asia and the Middle East. American collapse cannot be managed through simple territorial withdrawal because the empire is functional rather than territorial. If dollar dominance collapses, the entire American economic model implodes simultaneously. America imports $650 billion more than it exports annually, financed through dollar reserve status. The moment other countries stop accepting dollars for oil, commodities, and manufactured goods, American living standards collapse by 30 to 40% virtually overnight. This is not speculation. It is arithmetic. The global system would face cascading crises. Countries holding dollar reserves would face massive losses. International trade would require new settlement mechanisms that do not yet exist at scale. American military forces overseas would lose logistical support as host countries reject payment in depreciating currency. The historical parallel is not just Soviet collapse. It is the collapse of the British Empire between 1945 and 1970, which triggered multiple wars, including the partition of India, the Malayan Emergency, the Mau Mau Uprising, the Suez Crisis, and decades of instability. British collapse was managed relatively carefully with American support providing stability. American collapse will have no equivalent external stabilizer. Game theory predicts that rational actors will begin hedging against dollar collapse before it occurs, which creates self-fulfilling prophecy. If China, Saudi Arabia, and India believe dollar dominance is ending, they will reduce dollar exposure, which accelerates the decline, which reinforces the belief. This is identical to bank-run dynamics, where individual rational decisions create collective catastrophe. The timeline is uncertain, but the direction is clear. The 5 warnings the Soviets ignored took approximately 6 years from Afghanistan invasion in 1979 to Gorbachev's reforms in 1985. Then another 6 years to full collapse in 1991. America's 5 warnings have manifested between 2022 and 2024. If the pattern holds, we are looking at major structural crisis between 2028 and 2032. That timeline aligns with other structural factors. The 2022 the 2482 for American election will likely be contested regardless of outcome, deepening domestic division. The Taiwan situation is expected to reach crisis point between 2025 and 2027, according to American military assessments. The petrodollar system faces challenge as Saudi Arabia's 50-year agreement to price oil exclusively in dollars, signed in 1974, comes up for renegotiation. The convergence of these factors creates what complexity theorists call a phase transition point, where systems flip from one stable state to another. The Soviet system flipped from communist empire to Russian Federation in 36 months. The American system could flip from unipolar hegemon to multipolar participant even faster, given the speed of modern financial systems. The truth no one wants to hear here is what needs to be said clearly. America is not too big to fail. Every empire in history believed it was exceptional and immune to the forces that destroyed previous empires. Rome believed it. The Mongols believed it. The British believed it. The Soviets believed it. They were all wrong. The pattern is consistent across civilizational timescales. Empires overextend militarily, exhaust themselves economically, lose ideological legitimacy, accumulate unsustainable debt, and suffer strategic defeats that shatter the mystique of invincibility. Once that mystique breaks, the psychological foundation collapses and the empire fragments rapidly. American exceptionalism is the belief that America is somehow exempt from this pattern. The evidence suggests otherwise. Every single structural indicator that preceded Soviet collapse is now present in American trajectory. Military overextension, economic stagnation masked by resource extraction, ideological delegitimization, fiscal unsustainability, and strategic defeat by proxy. The question is not whether America will decline from hegemonic position. That is already occurring measurably across economic, military, and diplomatic dimensions.